Gandalf whistled again, but Nori and Ori were there almost before he had stopped. For, if you remember, Gandalf had told them to come in pairs every 5 minutes. "Hullo," said Beorn. "You came pretty quick. Where were you hiding? Come on, my jack-in-the-boxes." "Nori at your service. Ori at," they began, but Beorn interrupted them. "Thank you. When I want your help, I will ask for it. Sit down and let's get on with this tale, or it will be supper time before it is ended." "As soon as we were asleep," went on Gandalf, "a crack at the back of the cave opened. Goblins came out and grabbed the Hobbit and the dwarves and our troop of ponies." "Troop of ponies? What were you, a traveling circus? Or were you carrying lots of goods? Or do you always call 6 a troop?" "Oh, no. As a matter of fact, there were more than 6 ponies, for there were more than 6 of us. And, well, here are 2 more." Just at that moment, Balin and Dwalin appeared and bowed so low that their beards swept the stone floor. The big man was frowning at first, but they did their best to be frightfully polite and kept on nodding and bending and bowing and waving their hoods before their knees in proper dwarf fashion, till he stopped frowning and burst into a chuckling laugh. They looked so comical. "Shroop was right," he said. "A fine comic one. Come in, my merry men, and what are your names? I don't want your service just now, only your names. And then sit down and stop wagging." "Balin and Dwalin," they said, not daring to be offended, and sat flop on the floor, looking rather surprised. "Now go on again," said Beorn to the wizard. "Where was I? Oh, yes, I was not grabbed. I killed a goblin or 2 with a flash." "Good," growled Beorn. "It is some good being a wizard, then," and slipped inside the crack before it closed. I followed down into the main hall, which was crowded with goblins. The great goblin was there with 30 or 40 armed guards. I thought to myself, even if they were not all chained together, what can a dozen do against so many? "A dozen? That's the first time I've heard 8 called a dozen. Or have you still got some more jacks that haven't yet come out of their boxes?" "Well, yes, there seem to be a couple more here now. Feely and Keely, I believe," said Gandalf, as these 2 now appeared and stood smiling and bowing. "That's enough," said Beorn. "Sit down and be quiet. Now go on, Gandalf." So Gandalf went on with the tale until he came to the fight in the dark, the discovery of the lower gate, and their horror when they found that Mr. Baggin had been mislaid. We counted ourselves and found that there was no Hobbit. There were only 14 of us left. 14? That's the first time I've heard 1 from 10 leave 14. "You mean 9, or else you haven't told me yet all the names of your party." "Well, of course you haven't seen Oin and Gloin yet, and bless me, here they are. I hope you will forgive them for bothering you." "Oh, let 'em all come. Hurry up. Come along, you 2, and sit down." "But look here, Gandalf. Even now we have only got yourself and 10 dwarves and the Hobbit that was lost. That only makes 11, plus 1 mislaid, and not 14, unless wizards count differently to other people. But now please get on with the tale." Beorn did not show it more than he could help, but really he had begun to get very interested. You see, in the old days he had known the very part of the mountains that Gandalf was describing. He nodded and he growled when he heard of the hobbits' reappearance and of their scramble down the stone slide and of the wolf ring in the woods. When Gandalf came to their climbing into trees with the wolves all underneath, he got up and strode about and muttered, "I wish I had been there. I would have given them more than fireworks." "Well," said Gandalf, very glad to see that his tale was making a good impression, "I did the best I could. There we were with the wolves going mad underneath us and the forest beginning to blaze in places, when the goblins came down from the hills and discovered us. They yelled with delight and sang songs making fun of us. 15 birds and 5 fir trees." "Good heavens," growled Beorn. "Don't pretend that goblins can't count. They can. 12 isn't 15, and they know it. And so do I. There were Bifur and Boffer as well. I haven't ventured to introduce them before, but here they are." In came Bifur and Boffer. "And me," gasped Bumper, puffing up behind. He was fat, and also angry at being left till last. He refused to wait 5 minutes, and followed immediately after the other 2. "Well, now there are 15 of you, and since goblins can count, I suppose that is all that there were up the trees. Now perhaps we can finish this story without any more interruptions. Mr. Baggins saw then how clever Gandalf had been. The interruptions had really made Beorn more interested in the story, and the story had kept him from sending the dwarves off at once like suspicious beggars. He never invited people into his house, if he could help it. He had very few friends, and they lived a good way away, and he never invited more than a couple of these to his house at a time. Now he had got 15 strangers sitting in his porch. By the time the wizard had finished his tale and had told of the eagle's rescue, and of how they had all been brought to the Carrick, the sun had fallen behind the peaks of the misty mountains, and the shadows were long in Beorn's garden. "A very good tale," said he, "the best I have heard for a long while. If all the beggars could tell such a good one, they might find me kinder. You may be making it all up, of course, but you deserve a supper for the story all the same. Let's have something to eat." "Yes, please," they all said together. "Thank you very much." Inside the hall it was now quite dark. Beorn clapped his hands, and in trotted 4 beautiful white ponies and several large, long-bodied gray dogs. Beorn said something to them in a queer language, like animal noises turned into talk. They went out again and soon came back carrying torches in their mouths, which they lit at the fire and stuck in low brackets on the pillars of the hall about the central hearth. The dogs could stand on their hind legs when they wished, and carry things with their 4 feet. Quickly they got out boards and trestles from the side walls and set them up near the fire. Then ba, ba, ba was heard, and in came snow-white sheep, led by a large coal-black ram. One bore a white cloth embroidered at the edges with figures of animals. Others bore on their broad backs trays with bowls and platters and knives and wooden spoons, which the dogs took out and quickly laid on the trestle tables. These were very low, low enough even for Bilbo to sit at comfortably. Beside them, a pony pushed 2 low-seated benches with wide rush bottoms and little short, thick legs for Gandalf and Thorin, while at the far end he put Beorn's big black chair of the same sort, in which he sat with his great legs stuck far out under the table. These were all the chairs he had in his hall, and he probably had them low like the tables, for the convenience of the wonderful animals that waited on him. What did the rest sit on? They were not forgotten. The other ponies came in, rolling round, drum-shaped sections of logs, smoothed and polished, and low enough even for Bilbo, so soon they were all seated at Beorn's table, and the hall had not seen such a gathering for many a year. There they had a supper, or a dinner, such as they had not had since they left the last homely house in the west, and said good-bye to Elrond. The light of the torches and the fire flickered about them, and on the table were 2 tall red beeswax candles. All the time they ate, Beorn, in his deep rolling voice, told tales of the wild lands on this side of the mountains, and especially of the dark and dangerous wood that lay outstretched far to north and south, a day's ride before them, barring their way to the east, the terrible forest of Mirkwood. The dwarves listened and shook their beards, for they knew that they must soon venture into that forest, and that after the mountains it was the worst of the perils they had to pass before they came to the dragon's stronghold. When dinner was over, they began to tell tales of their own, but Beorn seemed to be growing drowsy and paid little heed to them. They spoke most of gold and silver and jewels, and the making of things by smithcraft, and Beorn did not appear to care for such things. There were no things of gold or silver in his hall, and few save the knives were made of metal at all. They sat long at the table with their wooden drinking bowls filled with mead. The dark night came on outside. The fires in the middle of the hall were built with fresh logs, and the torches were put out, and still they sat in the light of the dancing flames, with the pillars of the house standing tall behind them, and dark at the top like trees of the forest. Whether it was magic or not, it seemed to Bilbo that he had heard a sound like wind in the branches stirring in the rafters, and the hoot of owls. Soon he began to nod with sleep, and the voices seemed to grow far away, until he woke with a start. The great door had creaked and slammed. Beorn was gone. The dwarves were sitting cross-legged on the floor round the fire, and presently they began to sing. Some of the verses were like this, but there were many more, and their singing went on for a long while. The wind was on the withered heath, but in the forest stirred no leaf. Their shadows lay by night and day, and dark things silent crept beneath. The wind came down from mountains cold, and like a tide it roared and rolled. The branches groaned, the forest moaned, the leaves were laid upon the mould. The wind went on from west to east, all movement in the forest ceased, but shrill and harsh across the marsh, its whistling voices were released. The grasses hissed, their tassels bent, the reeds were rattling, on it went, or shaken pool under heaven's cool, where racing clouds were torn and rent. It passed the lonely mountain bare, and swept above the dragon's lair. There black and dark lay boulders stark, and flying smoke was in the air. It left the world and took its flight over the wide seas of the night. The moon set sail upon the gale, and stars were fanned to leaping light. Bilbo began to nod again. Suddenly up stood Gandalf. "It is time for us to sleep," he said. "For us, but not, I think, for Beorn. In this hall we can rest sound and safe. But I warn you all not to forget what Beorn said before he left us. You must not stray outside until the sun is up, on your peril." Bilbo found that beds had already been laid at the side of the hall, on a sort of raised platform between the pillars and the outer wall. For him there was a little mattress of straw and woolen blankets. He snuggled into them very gladly, summertime though it was. The fire burned low, and he fell asleep. Yet in the night he woke. The fire had now sunk to a few embers. The dwarves and Gandalf were all asleep, to judge by their breathing. A splash of white on the floor came from the high moon, which was peering down through the smoke hole in the roof. There was a growling sound outside, and a noise as of some great animal scuffling at the door. Bilbo wondered what it was, and whether it could be Beorn in enchanted shape, and if he would come in as a bear and kill them. He dived under the blankets and hid his head, and fell asleep again at last in spite of his fears. It was full morning when he awoke. One of the dwarves had fallen over him in the shadows where he lay, and had rolled down with a bump from the platform onto the floor. It was Boffer, and he was grumbling about it when Bilbo opened his eyes. "Get up, lazybones," he said, "or there will be no breakfast left for you." Up jumped Bilbo. "Breakfast!" he cried. "Where is breakfast?" "Mostly inside us," answered the other dwarves, who were moving about the hall. But what is left is out on the veranda. We have been about looking for Beorn ever since the sun got up, but there is no sign of him anywhere, though we found breakfast laid as soon as we went out." "Where is Gandalf?" asked Bilbo, moving off to find something to eat as quick as he could. "Oh, out and about somewhere," they told him. But he saw no sign of the wizard all that day until the evening. Just before sunset he walked into the hall, where the Hobbit and the dwarves were having supper, waited on by Beorn's wonderful animals, as they had been all day. Of Beorn they had seen and heard nothing since the night before, and they were getting puzzled. "Where is our host, and where have you been all day yourself?" they all cried. "One question at a time, and none till after supper. I haven't had a bite since breakfast." At last Gandalf pushed away his plate and jug. He had eaten 2 whole loaves, with masses of butter and honey and clotted cream, and drunk at least a quart of mead, and he took out his pipe. "I will answer the second question first," he said. "But bless me, this is a splendid place for smoke rings." Indeed, for a long time they could get nothing more out of him. He was so busy sending smoke rings dodging round the pillars of the hall, changing them into all sorts of different shapes and colors, and setting them at last chasing one another out of the hole in the roof. They must have looked very queer from outside, popping out into the air one after another, green, blue, red, silver gray, yellow, white, big ones, little ones dodging through big ones and joining into figure eights, and going off like a flock of birds into the distance. "I have been picking out bear tracks," he said at last. "There must have been a regular bears' meeting outside here last night. I soon saw that Beorn could not have made them all. There were far too many of them, and they were of various sizes, too. I should say there were little bears, large bears, ordinary bears, and gigantic big bears, all dancing outside from dark to nearly dawn. They came from almost every direction, except from the west over the river, from the mountains. In that direction only one set of footprints led, none coming, only ones going away from here. I followed these as far as the Karrak. There they disappeared into the river, but the water was too deep and strong beyond the rock for me to cross. It is easy enough, as you remember, to get from this bank to the Karrak by the ford, but on the other side is a cliff standing up from a swirling channel. I had to walk 8 miles before I found a place where the river was wide and shallow enough for me to wade and swim, and then miles back again to pick up the tracks again. But by that time it was too late for me to follow them far. They went straight off in the direction of the pine woods on the east side of the Misty Mountains, where we had our pleasant little party with the wargs the night before last. And now I think I have answered your first question, too, ended Gandalf, and he sat a long while silent. Bilbo thought he knew what the wizard meant. "What shall we do?" he cried. "If he leads all the wargs and the goblins down here, we shall all be caught and killed. I thought you said he was not a friend of theirs." "So I did, and don't be silly. You had better go to bed. Your wits are sleepy."